Kia tikuna e karakia mo tātou I tēnei ata. Pou hihiri, pou rarama. Tia ho I roto, tia ho I waho. Marama I roto, marama I waho. Tēnā te pou kai a tātou. Te pou o te wānanga, te pou o te mātauranga, te pou o ngā ahurea, puta noa I te ao. Tūturu whakamaua kia tīna. Haumi e hui e tai ki hia. Kai ngā rangatira, koutou te aumangea, nau mai, haere mai, nau mai ki tēnei o ngā wānanga, I te wānanga aro nui o tāmaki makaurau. Koutou ngā waiwai tapu, ngā rangatira ngā ariki, haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. Koutou e pupuri nei I te mauri o te mātauranga, I te mauri o te ao, rangahau, nau mai, haere mai. Kia koutou ngā rangatira kai waho kai ngā ao, ngā tōpito o te ao, te hunga e nohana ki tā wāhi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. O tira kia koe te ihorangi Terry Irwin, tēnei hoki te mihi kia koe, haramai nau mai me ngā mate ngā aitua kai runga I a tata, kia noho haumari mau koutou I te mate uruta, te korona, te kaumaiwa. No reira putanoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kahuri.
Well, that was such a warm introduction. I'm really pleased to be with everyone here. And I feel like I should, since this is a conference based in New Zealand, especially, I need to say that our work is very much aimed at westernized colonial societies that have long since, for the most part, lost their connection to place and even their own culture. And I think it's the indigenous nations, peoples on the planet to which we need to look because they never lost the knowledge. And the reason that we give these talks is to try to get more and more of us thinking about what it means to live appropriately on the planet and recapture an understanding of systems and place. So with that, I'll get started. In the lecture today, I'm going to introduce transition design, a new area of transdisciplinary design focus, which is aimed at addressing complex wicked problems and catalyzing transitions toward more sustainable, equitable, and desirable long-term futures. I'll also discuss how change happens within our complex socio-technical systems and how addressing wicked problems can actually be a strategy for changing the trajectory of the transitions we're already in. Then at the end of my talk, I'll show some examples of the types of systems maps that can be useful in designing for positive systems level change. So we often discuss transition design in relation to two other important areas of design focus, along a continuum in which the scale of time, the depth of engagement, and the size of context expands to include both social and environmental concerns. So service design, as we know, is now a well-established area of design focus, usually practiced within the for-profit economic paradigm, which, as we know, is itself inherently unsustainable over the long haul. Design for social innovation is a relatively new and still developing discipline that begins to challenge dominant socioeconomic paradigms by leveraging unused social resources and proposing alternative economic models. Transition design calls for new and radically different socioeconomic political paradigms based upon the reconception of entire lifestyles. These lifestyles are local and place-based, but cosmopolitan in their regional and global exchange of information and technology, cosmopolitan localism. Transition design argues that societal transitions toward more sustainable futures are actually design problems, and that design and designers have a key role to play in these transitions. But it's really important to say that we call it design because of its intentionality, not because designers are leading the process. In fact, transition design is not expert-led. Designers will be among many experts from different fields and disciplines working in a co-design process with stakeholders who are connected to and affected by the wicked problems. So transition design in a way brings together two global memes. First is the idea that entire societies must transition toward more sustainable, equitable, and desirable long-term futures. And second, the realization that these transitions will require intentional systems level change. And you can really see evidence of these memes in the number of transition related projects and initiatives that are springing up all around the world, and the recent rise in what I'll call deep systems thinking and the proliferation of knowledge, tools, and processes for understanding complex systems and systems problems. So wicked problems are things like this: crime, income inequality, climate change, terrorism, loss of biodiversity, lack of access to affordable housing and education, political and social polarization, and global pandemics. And unfortunately, as we know, this list goes on and on. And wicked problems are systems problems with these characteristics. And among the most challenging are that every wicked problem is unique and constantly changing. There are multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas and no clear shared problem definition. These problems straddle organizational and disciplinary boundaries, and every wicked problem is connected to other wicked problems. We've all been living through a case study in that for almost 2 years now. So these complex systems problems are situated within systems context. To be precise, within socio-technical ecological systems, which are really tangles of people, technology, processes, and interactions, all of which are embedded within the natural world. So we're dealing with radically complex systems problems situated within radically large systems contexts. So you would think it would logically follow that we need to frame these problems in radically large contexts and address them all at once. However, most of the time, we do exactly the opposite. And I think it's because looking this kind of complexity straight in the eye can be incredibly daunting. So instead, we do this. We view problems within the narrow but manageable context of our organizations, industry sectors, fields, or disciplines. Areas like local or national government, policy, the nonprofit sector, NGOs, funding and philanthropy, and of course, all kinds of industry and many more. We identify a problem within our organization or sector, and usually it's urgent. We're all doing triage all the time, and we set about finding a solution for it. And we secretly hope to find that single silver bullet solution for that single problem. This hope runs really deep in all of us, that if I just look hard enough, I'll find the right solution. But we often harbor a couple of other hopes as well. We often secretly hope it can be solved with either money and or technology, because these are clear, quick, doable fixes. And this is going on in different sectors all the time. The only real difference is that each sector or discipline has its own unique problem-solving methodologies, processes, and tools. And these approaches work really well as long as we stay in our own field of expertise. But trying to collaborate across disciplinary divides, or even perhaps across departments in large organizations, can be challenging to say the least. It's a little like this old parable of the blind monks and the elephant. It looks like a different animal depending upon your perspective. So achieving a shared problem definition across sectors becomes impossible. But here's the catch. Single silver bullet solutions only work on simple problems. When it comes to wicked ones, they're rubbish. Here's basically what happens. We think we're addressing a single problem when we are actually dealing with a problem cluster. Multiple interconnected and interdependent problems whose interconnections remain invisible to us. So we just keep aiming single solutions at pieces of a problem cluster, thinking it's a single problem. And we can keep doing this for weeks or months or even years. And we might put dents in the problem, but despite all the resources and energy we keep investing, many problems resist resolution because we don't see that these seemingly unrelated problems are actually connected to each other in very complex ways, within and across sectors. But wait, it gets worse. These problems are also connected up and down systems levels. So to understand these problems, we have to look upstream, or more precisely, up systems levels. Because this is what we're often dealing with, a complex web of interconnections and interdependencies across sectors and up and down systems levels. And it's this web of connections that involves both social and material interactions that keep these problems stuck and extends their consequences into the social and environmental spheres. This is why we call them wicked. And here is how we think about the tools and approaches needed at the different levels. So at the lower levels, we're finding and resolving familiar problems in our own sector or industry using familiar tools and methodologies. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. If we trace the problems resisting resolution upstream to higher systems levels, we're getting into territory in which collaboration across disciplinary divides has to happen, even though it's difficult. And it requires tools and innovative cross-disciplinary approaches. Now, these approaches are new, but they do exist. But at the level of a wicked problem, we are in new territory. There are very few existing tools and approaches for addressing these problems. And yet, here's the thing. If we solve for a wicked problem upstream, the positive results trickle downstream and solve for multiple seemingly unrelated problems simultaneously. And that is really the premise for transition design. Now, I've diagrammed all this in a very simplistic way. In fact, I've drawn them like we think of them, little separate boxes with their own little separate issues. And this type of compartmentalized thinking is actually part of the problem. In fact, it's a wicked problem in its own right, because this is actually more what it looks like. Multiple sectors, industries, and fields of all sizes represented by the white bubbles, with countless interconnected, interdependent problems overlapping them in the blue and the orange bubbles. And it's this invisible and unexamined web of interconnections and interdependencies across those sectors and up and down systems levels that keeps these problems stuck. And to complicate things even more, these problems are heating up and cooling off all the time, a bit like twinkle lights. And the trick is learning to read complex systems to see which problem clusters are lighting up at any given moment. So hopefully you get the idea. So transition design argues that to address complex wicked problems effectively, we need to address them systemically. And to do this, we need to understand how they connect, you know what I'm going to say next, across those sectors and up and down systems levels. But in order to do this, we need to develop entire ecologies of systems interventions. We actually need to intervene in wicked problems the same way acupuncturists use needles to intervene in our own systems to transition them back into health and balance. But here's the thing. The acupuncturist has a map of the system and we don't. So in a way, we're flying blind whenever we implement any solution to a wicked problem. So what we need is a map of the system's problem we're trying to address, as well as a map of its system's context. But to do this, we need a better understanding of systems themselves, how they behave, and how they transition over time. So essentially, we all need to become students of systems. And systems are perhaps best explained by this old joke. Two fish bump into each other and one says, "How's the water?" And the other says, "What water?" Marshall McLuhan, in his book, War and Peace in the Global Village, said one thing fish know nothing about is water, since they have no anti-environment which would enable them to perceive the element they live in. Systems are so ubiquitous and our interactions with them are so pervasive, many of us don't really see them and therefore we don't understand them very well. Our work at the Transition Design Institute is partly concerned with how we can learn to see systems and understand how they behave. So we live in a world of systems, nested within systems, nested within systems. There are transportation systems, infrastructural systems, financial, economic, and communication systems. And all of these are permeated by cultural and disciplinary norms, laws and informal practices, and general ways of doing things. And together, all of these form what are known as socio-technical systems, which are, as I said before, situated in the natural world. And these systems are always in transition. But despite their constant movement, socio-technical systems are highly resistant to change. They get set in their ways, just like we do. But change they can, as a result of three things: large and small events, technological innovations and breakthroughs, and changes in beliefs, social norms, and practices. So in both material and non-material ways. And any of these changes can happen suddenly or gradually. But let's come back to the concept of transition. Human societies are always in transition, but these transitions have been largely unintentional, full of drift, and we really only understand their ramifications in hindsight. We call it history. The question before all of us in the 21st century is whether we can intentionally transition our organizations and societies toward more sustainable, equitable, and desirable long-term futures. And transition design argues that the long-term futures we're currently transitioning toward aren't necessarily the futures we want, but argues that we can intentionally change these transition trajectories toward futures we do want. Now, I know that sounds like a monumental undertaking, but if we use the context of the situation we are still in to think about transition trajectories, we see that all of these countries started out about 2 years ago in relatively the same place. And we've learned that small changes in the present can make a big difference in where you end up in the future. So transition design is essentially an approach to intentionally shift our system's transition trajectories. So now I want to talk about how we can increase our understanding of how these large societal systems change and transition over time. And I'm going to use COVID as an example. So the multi-level perspective tool, or MLP, is a framework developed 2 decades ago in Northern Europe to explain how socio-technical systems change and transition over long periods of time. And those researchers identified 3 key levels: the landscape, the regime or status quo, and the niche. The landscape level is where large events, collective beliefs, and social norms begin to impact and fracture the regime level, or the level where we all live below. And landscape level events usually accrue and exert gradual pressure. But as you can see, events like war, 9/11, and COVID-19 can appear suddenly and unexpectedly at the landscape level and create sweeping change throughout the system. The niche level at the bottom is where small experiments and innovations can be incubated off the radar and go unchallenged by the status quo. And niche level events include things like new inventions, technologies, and practices, or even radical new policy ideas such as universal basic income, well, radical in the US. But the important thing to know is that large unexpected events like COVID-19 always open up opportunities at the niche level that can be exploited for good if we can learn how to read the system's dynamics. I'm going to show you just two examples of how change can happen in a socio-technical system, but there are countless others. Here, conditions already present at the regime level begin to constellate and exert pressure from within, opening up a fracture and letting niche level innovations rush in. So startups like Airbnb and Uber, combined with social networking technologies, exploited the fracture and rushed into the regime. And the speed at which they were absorbed into and transformed the regime was astounding. Their integration into the regime created more fractures, and new industry ecologies formed around both Uber and Airbnb, utterly transforming the tourism industry as just one example. Now, a decade later, what started at the niche level as sharing economy experiments have permeated the regime and led to the rise of the sharing economic paradigm at the landscape level. But here's the thing. With these transitions come myriad unintended consequences in the form of wicked problems like the ones in red. Now, this is how the regime had looked for some time. But last year, just a few months into the pandemic, Uber laid off 3,500 people in a 3-minute Zoom call, followed by layoffs of another 3,000 employees just a few weeks later. Airbnb soon followed suit with the layoff of 25% of their workforce, all because of a major disruption at the landscape level known as COVID-19, our second example, which showed up suddenly as a problem of nearly unprecedented global magnitude. And you can still watch it fracturing the regime in real time, igniting a flurry of niche level activity that's almost impossible to follow, but which contains within it the seeds of paradigmatic change for either good or bad. And as we observe the accelerated transition we're still in, we have to try and anticipate the unintended consequences of all the new innovations and challenges that are bubbling up into the regime, so that before they turn into wicked problems, we begin to intervene. But I think even more importantly, we have to try and quickly read the system's dynamics to see where there are openings to drive positive systems level change and shift our current unsustainable transition trajectories. So in March and April and early May of 2020, we started a research project to map the spread of and response to COVID-19 in the US using the transition design approach. And this is where you can kind of see the utility of these systems maps. So first we map the problem in these 5 areas to understand the interconnections, feedback loops, and stuck places in the problem in the present. In the second phase of research, we went back in time using the MLP that you just saw to try and understand how issues related to the problem evolved over time. And we do this in order to reveal new insights and connections from the past that deepen our understanding of the problem and response to the problem in the present. So these 2 phases of research, when combined with a third foresighting and backcasting phase, create a radically large problem context that includes the past, the present, and the future. Fast Company wrote a little article about this map if you want to check it out, but the map itself is also available on my academia.edu page if you want to take a closer look. These maps are quite large. The problem map on the left is 22 feet tall, and the historic evolution map is about 18 feet long. And together, they take steps toward creating a systems view of the problem about a year ago. In mapping wicked problems, we always work with these 5 archetypal societal categories because it's the interconnections and interdependencies between issues in these areas that keep them stuck. But these same dynamics can be leveraged to create interventions that ignite positive change. I'll quickly walk you around the problem map, and what we're doing is mapping issues related to or caused by COVID-19 in the 5 archetypal categories. Key insights or issues that are pivotal or urgent have been highlighted in red boxes, and all of the content in the boxes come directly from research whose sources are cited in the interface. There's an entire 20-minute lecture on this project up online. I can give you the link for those of you that might be interested. So if we look at the environmental issues section, we see that COVID-19 is of zoonotic origins, meaning that viruses like this make the leap from animals to humans, keyword here, when their habitats are destroyed and new interactions between species occur. And this can often happen when they're brought into contact with humans in wet markets. Now, if we look at wet markets in the economics section, we see that they're part of a $73 billion luxury food industry in which wild animals are captured or farmed for consumption or use in some types of Chinese medicine. Now, here's the thing, even though we've known about the connection between the destruction of wildlife habitat and viruses like COVID-19 for a really long time, this industry has grown to now employ 1 million people, making it nearly impossible to shut down. Now, if we go to the political and governance section to see whether legislation could be developed to address this problem, we see that policies banning the sale of wild animals are likely to drive the entire industry underground, which would result in a black market, which would remove what few oversights do exist, which could lead to even more pandemics. Now, the social issues section looks at what we humans think and how we act. And here we see that our attitudes about and relationship to animals are one of the root causes of the pandemic. And many disease experts are arguing that we should view the pandemic as a warning that humans must begin to see animals as partners whose health and habitat welfare is intimately connected to our own. So you see what we're doing is walking you around a map to see how these issues are interrelated, interconnected, and causal. They are connected to each other via complex feedback loops that can be actually leveraged in creating solutions if we understand the dynamics among them. So once we mapped the problem in the present, we wanted to understand the historic evolution of some of these issues that led to COVID-19 in the US. And that is a long timeline map. So we brought key insights over from the problem map and placed them at the beginning of a timeline, which for us begins in 1770 with the framing of our Constitution, which we think had a direct bearing on, I'll call it, the unique American response to COVID-19. Entries in red indicate pandemic-related events, and you can see large events that shaped the US response at that top landscape level. So along the timeline, we pull out narrative threads and insights about the past that help us understand the problem in the present. And here we see that the roots of the American concern with civil liberties and that right to bear arms, how does the rest of the world live without guns? I don't get it. And little did we imagine a year ago the extent to which the pandemic would be politicized and culminate on January 6th with an insurrection that nearly toppled the US democracy. At the landscape level, we see that the Southern enslavement economy contributed to over 400 years of institutionalized racism in the US, which is directly connected to the vulnerability of our African American and Black populations contracting and dying from COVID in wildly disproportionate numbers. And this was also, of course, connected to the Black Lives Matter protests around the world over George Floyd's death at the hands of Minneapolis police. So really, the pandemic has thrown a spotlight on all of the infrastructural weaknesses in the US, especially our healthcare system. Tracing its evolution, we see that the founding of the American Medical Association and its early profit-based partnership with Big Pharma, which continues to this day, helps explain why our system is so broken. An article in the New York Times last year pointed out that the US, this is hard to believe, almost got universal healthcare coverage in 1947, but segregationists blocked it out of fear it would lead to racially integrated hospitals. So here we see a classic wicked problem cluster that includes COVID-19, the broken US healthcare system, and racism. Another important historical fact is that the coronavirus was discovered in 1967. So for over half a century, we've known that it's zoonotic in origin. We know that deforestation is at the root of its spread, and still the luxury food industry continues to grow and deforestation continues to accelerate. So I'm going to stop here and move on, but I want to reiterate that the reason we map problems in the present and the past is because it helps us understand the problem deeply enough to intervene in a systematic way. And westernized societies have increasingly short memories and are increasingly disconnected from place. So by identifying a problem cluster like this, we're actually able to develop an entire ecology of systems interventions that hopefully solve for multiple issues and multiple problems simultaneously. Now, I want to introduce you quickly to the emerging transition design approach. So transition design began with the theoretical framework you see on the top here, which is essentially the theory and methodology which introduces ideas intended to get us thinking differently about problems, the futures we want, and how to get there. But perhaps most importantly, it challenges us to think about how both individually and collectively we need to change in order to inhabit the planet in a more sustainable, equitable, and desirable way. So these new ideas, visions, mindsets, and postures form the foundation upon which new ways of designing then evolved into an applied transition design approach, not process. I'll tell you why not process in a minute. So the applied approach frames wicked problems and problem clusters within radically large problem contexts that include the past, the present, and the future. In the present, we map the myriad issues connected to the problem to understand their interconnections and interdependencies. But we also identify the multiple stakeholder groups connected to and affected by the problem, as well as the problematic relations among them. Chief among those are uneven power dynamics. Next, we expand the problem frame into the distant past in order to understand its historic evolution, as I just showed you. Then we extend the problem frame into the distant future. It's amazing how often we start to solve problems with no idea of what we want to transition toward. So on actual projects, stakeholders would co-create visions of a long-term future that was sustainable, equitable, and mutually desirable. And in workshops, teams have to do research and speculate on this piece. The final step before systems interventions or solutions can be created is designing for a decades-long transition between the problematic present and the long-term desired future. And this is perhaps the most important and most difficult aspect for westernized societies, thinking rigorously about this journey and being able to maintain consistency over long arcs of time, something 21st century westernized societies are not very good at. So after extending the problem frame to include the past, present, and future, then and only then do we have enough information to intervene in an informed, systemic way with those ecologies of systems interventions that act as steps along the transition pathway toward the desired future. I want to emphasize that we say transition design is an approach as opposed to a templatized process with a special set of tools that are replicable, and here's why. There are innumerable existing frameworks, processes, and knowledge sets across countless fields and disciplines aimed at problem solving that all work really well on projects, initiatives, and lower level systems problems. And all of them can be used to create interventions on transition design initiatives. So transition design is basically a meta-level approach for framing problems within radically large spatiotemporal contexts. It's essentially a set of questions that need to be asked and answered in order for these transitions to take place. So these are essentially the questions that need to get asked and answered that I've walked you through in the steps before. But here's the thing. Designing for transitions is not a finite linear approach. In fact, it's more like designing software. You're always working on the next release and it's never done. So it's actually a cyclical process in which we are problem mapping, future visioning, and systems solutioning. And then we're waiting to see how the systems respond to our interventions. And this is another thing we're not very good at. Doing nothing, waiting, observing, sensing. Because time is money and we want quick, measurable results. But guess what? Working in systems, healing systems means working in different time horizons and framing the initial conditions for emergence. And emergence means you don't know what's going to come. You have to wait and see and then dance with it. So hopefully you see now what we mean when we say that transition design is a meta-level approach for framing complex, wicked problems in radically large spatiotemporal contexts. It is not a recipe, template, or process for solving wicked problems. You can't solve any two the same way. The tools that we and our doctoral students have developed should always be considered a departure point on actual projects that invite innovation and hacking to make them place and culture appropriate. Now to finish, I'm just going to quickly show you some images from our online seminars and research engagements. So since 2019, we've run dozens of online workshops with people all over the world in groups as large as 80 people using Miro and Zoom technologies with the templates you see here. And we do it to both teach the transition design approach and systems thinking in general, as well as run workshops with stakeholders in which we gather data to try and facilitate these systems maps. We've divided the approach into 6 steps that correspond to these questions that you saw before. And so the participants are interacting with these templates, really just having to fill out Post-it notes in the Miro boards. And all of the workshops culminate with this template, which challenges teams to develop an entire ecology of systems interventions, which are interrelated, interdependent solutions situated in different sectors at different levels of scale that together have enough traction to destabilize that stuck systems problem and begin to catalyze positive systems level change. And these lectures are held in group Zoom spaces, and then the teams are working, teams of 6 or 8 people are working in Zoom breakout rooms. And we're constantly surprised by the amount of data that can be gathered this way because people are sparking off each other. You get a lot more data and a lot more learning than you would if people were working alone. Here's mapping relations for poor waste management in Pittsburgh. And one thing I want to underscore is transition design argues that stakeholders will always include both the human and the non-human, the living and the non-living. So here you see that Pittsburgh's waterways have been acknowledged as stakeholders that are connected to the wicked problem of poor waste management. So advocates for other must be appointed to represent these non-human stakeholders. This shows how teams map the historic evolution of a problem using the Miro template. And this is a group of faculty from Monterrey Tech University in Mexico who just completely departed from the template, which we always encourage people to do, and just innovated like crazy using Donella Meadows' leverage points for change to base their interventions on. And it's just incredibly gratifying to see how people take these ideas, they make it appropriate for their culture, and then they just run with it. These next few are examples of what we have a doctorate in transition design, and this is what our PhD students do when they have a longer period of time to do research and map these things more thoroughly. Here, this map really looks at the feedback loops and the systems dynamics involved in isolation of the elderly in Pittsburgh. This is the historical evolution of deforestation in Pittsburgh, and note at that lower niche level how technological innovations actually fuel deforestation. So everything at the niche level is not a good thing. And finally, this map looks at the evolution of a lack of access to healthy food in Pittsburgh. And it's a really good example of how when you have a team at work over weeks or months, the amount of historical mapping that you can do, which actually informs solutions in the present, can be significant. And finally, we ourselves are in the middle of a big research project right now. And this is a board that's emerging. We ran a workshop with about 80 stakeholders, and we are now taking their responses and creating ecologies of systems interventions completely based on their ideas. So if you'd like to know more about transition design, I'd suggest going to Medium and just searching for transition design, wicked problems. All of our students have to document their work every semester in these Medium posts, and they do a lot of analysis on it. So you can actually walk through the process, understand how both insights are derived from it as well as strategies. And there's a couple of more. And finally, the syllabus for the transition design seminar that Gideon, Kossoff, and I teach each spring is up online as an open source website. So there's a ton of information about the steps that I walked you through. There's a lot about the theory, but there's also a lot of links to readings and websites with other resources. And you can email me if you ever are trying to access something and you can't get it. Some of it's behind a firewall because of copyright issues. So to conclude, transition design research like this aims to produce a deeper understanding of the problem and its roots, and open up new and more effective strategies for problem resolution, which can lead to transitions, positive transitions. And it does this primarily by leveraging knowledge and wisdom that's already within the system, by framing problems within radically large contexts, by facilitating a shared understanding of the problem among stakeholder groups, and enabling those stakeholder groups to co-create long-term visions on a future on which they can agree. So that's it. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to answering your questions if I can.